Would you please stand? We, the jury, unanimously find the defendant, Amber Guyger, guilty of murder as charged in the indictment. No outburst. And it is signed by the presiding juror, who is juror number 11. Mr. Rogers, would you like to have the jury poll? No, Your Honor. All right. You may be seated, Ms. Guyger. We're going to take a break. You all will have a long lunch break today, and we will resume court at 1 p.m. Deputies, can you clear the courtroom for me, please?
Everybody clear the courtroom, we'd appreciate it. Head out.
All right, I want to take you now to Dallas, Texas, where former Dallas police officer Amber Guyger has been found guilty of murder. She is the Dallas police officer who killed a man named Botham Jean in his own home. He was unarmed.
So just that fact. But I think they must not have believed her story completely about her thinking it was her apartment, or they believed that must have been something that it wasn't reasonable to really think that you're going to miss all these clues, walk in, and then automatically assume that the person there is there to do you harm and pull out your gun. And maybe they did assume that all those things could have been reasonable up to the point where she got through the door. But they must have really latched on to the prosecution's argument that once she got to that door, she had other options, and she should have taken those options.
I'm going to take you back to the moment that that verdict was read in the courtroom. We have rewound that recording for you. Let's go ahead and play that back for you right now so you get a sense of what it was like when that verdict was read. Have a listen.
We, the jury, unanimously find the defendant, Amber Guyger, guilty of murder as charged in the indictment. No outburst. And it is signed by the presiding juror, who is juror number 11. Mr. Rogers, would you like to have the jury poll? No, Your Honor. All right. You may be seated, Ms. Guyger. We're going to take a break. You all will have a long lunch break today, and we will resume court at 1 p.m.
I want to say thank you to the jurors for being willing to make that tough decision. I want to say thank you to the prosecutors for the excellent job that they did. And now we're just going to move forward and continue to respond in the appropriate way going forward. But we just want to say, and the other thing that I want to say is that this also lets us know that the God that we serve is still on the throne.
That's right. Yeah.
God is still in control.
Amen.
And he has been all along. I have some other of my associates with me, Jonathan Morrison and also Colin Packer. I'd like for them to have comments.
Okay. What we're going to do at this time is we're going to take a few questions and we're going to take the family back up. So
There's so much stuff to see. 5 to 99 years. What do you think Amber Guyger deserves?
We believe in the wisdom of this jury. That decision is in the hands of this jury, and so we believe that Botham's life mattered, and we want to see a sentence that reflects that.
Yeah, and many people, a lot of commentators said there would be no murder conviction.
Right.
So right now we're already ahead of the game, and we welcome the jury's decision, as Attorney Merritt and Attorney Washington have said.
What we do know, though, is that Amber Guyger got on the stand and she testified without a doubt that she intended to kill Botham. And we just hope that the jury remembers that this is an individual that says she didn't make a mistake, she intended to kill. And we think that the sentence that they give her should reflect that.
You all know what? Imagine what the sentence would be if the roles were reversed and Botham Jean killed Amber Guyger. Why can't it be equal justice in America,
That's right,
no matter what the ethnicity of the murderer is?
And 2 days after she killed Botham, she was back sexting and talking about getting drunk. So this is a person that has no remorse. This is a person being in jail for 5 to 6 years will not be enough. So we want the sentence to definitely reflect that.
Do you worry about an appeal?
What was your sense of hearing the concept of mistake of fact and castle doctrine?
Well, here's what we know, and I'll let Lee talk, but here's what we know. We did not think mistake of fact and the castle doctrine should have gotten in there, but what the family know today and what we feel comfortable about, there's really nothing that the defense is going to be able to appeal. They got everything that they wanted, so and they did not get the verdict that they wanted, so we feel good about that.
And I'll just reiterate that the mistake of fact, and particularly the castle doctrine, was asinine to go before this jury. They had no business asserting the castle doctrine in someone else's home. I'm glad that the jury simply rejected that, and we can move forward from there. But when it's all said and done, you had someone who was completely unarmed, completely nonviolent, completely non-aggressive, sitting at his home, eating a bowl of ice cream, and someone barged into his home and shot him to death. And so when this family contacted us the day after this murder, we believed that the right conviction would happen. We believed that the right verdict would come out as guilty. We knew that in America that's rare. We knew we had a fight on our hands, but there were all the pieces in place. And I'll tell you what, this was a perfect storm of events. In terms of the justice system working together, you had a motivated district attorney's office who put on an excellent case. You had a progressive judge who made the right calls from the bench, and you had a Dallas County community that responded to the call to serve on these juries, as we need them to continue to do. So you had one of the most diverse juries that we ever seen. And when all those things worked together, I was convicted. I was certain of a conviction in this case.
And let me say this. This Dallas County has a precedence unlike anybody else in America. Remember Jordan Edwards' case.
Right.
District Attorney Faith Johnson made sure that that young unarmed child's life was not in vain when they got a conviction there. And now to get a conviction here, hopefully all the rest of the cities all across the United States will learn from Dallas, Texas, that justice means equal justice.
Let's bring in Omar Villafranca, our CBS News correspondent, who's there. He's been following the case all along. Omar, this was a story that had been followed by so many people. We saw Botham Jean's family there in the immediate aftermath after that jury came back with the verdict. Just describe the moments leading up to the verdict, when the jury filed back into the room, and what subsequently happened when she was found guilty.
And Vlad, I'm not trying to be distracted here, but this jury has been going since about yesterday when they were handed the case. So they've had this overnight. They started yesterday on their deliberations, and now they have come to a conclusion. There was two options that were on the table. There was manslaughter, punishable by up to 20 years or possibly probation, or murder. Everybody saw that as the higher bar to reach, but the jury said they basically heard enough, and they've come back with guilty of murder. Now, when we were basically listening and watching all this, there was audible sobbing inside the courtroom. Of course, the judge, Judge Tammy Kemp, has tried to keep the court very tight. She's telling everybody no outbursts at all in court. You had sobbing on one side from Guyger's family. Amber Guyger herself was seen kind of shaking from the backside. But for Botham Jean's family, there was more than a dozen here who came in from the island nation of St. Lucia. they were a different type of tier. So this puts to end, for now, basically something that's been going on for more than a year. Let's flash backwards about a year. September 6, 2018, Amber Guyger has just come off work. It's a Thursday. She's going to what she thinks is her apartment at the Southside Flats here in Dallas County, just really a few blocks away from Dallas Police headquarters. And she thinks she's going to her third floor apartment. Turns out she's actually going to her fourth floor apartment. She tries to put the key in her door. She sees it slightly open. Here's a commotion inside. Pulls her service pistol. She told the jury that she told this shadowy figure she saw in the background, "Let me see your hands, let me see your hands." That was Botham Jean, a 26-year-old from St. Lucia, worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers. He was an accountant. He said, "Hey, hey, hey," and that's when 2 shots were fired. One missed, another one hit him in the chest. Now, during the course of this trial, which lasted a little bit more than a week, we heard testimony from not only some of the officers who were responding, but also from neighbors and the lead investigator in this, David Armstrong, who's a Texas Ranger. The defense was basically saying it's a confusing-looking apartment complex. It was reasonable, they were saying, for Amber Guyger to go to the wrong apartment complex. But the prosecution was putting up a big fight saying, not really. She's a police officer. She's supposed to be observant. There was a red carpet that was on the ground in front of his particular unit that she should have seen. She should have been paying attention when opening the door. It was dark inside, but he said people's apartments smell different when you know it's not yours. Ultimately, the jury sided with the prosecution, and now the big question is, how long will her sentence be? The jury is going to take a break. Judge Tammy Kemp is going to give them time. They're going to come back around 1. She's been a little bit loose on her times and letting the jury kind of come when they're ready. So we're expecting after 1 o'clock, it's going to be the punishment phase. How long is she going to serve? We have to basically find out and see how long the jury gives her.
Omar, let me ask you this. So one of the things that was sort of controversial, Judge Tammy Kemp, and you just mentioned her, she ruled on Monday that one of the things that the jury could factor into their deliberations was the defense counsel's point that perhaps Amber Guyger was able to be protected under what's called the Castle Doctrine in Texas, which is a stand your ground law. It allows the deadly use of force by civilians on their property. They argue that she thought she was on her property. The prosecutor, Jason Fine, said that doesn't work here. It shouldn't apply. It protects homeowners against intruders, and now all of a sudden an intruder is trying to use it against the homeowner.
And it was interesting because the defense did not wanted that in there. The prosecution did not want. And of course, in the courtroom, on social media, people were, of course, asking the Castle Doctrine, how is this possible? To put it in simple terms, and let me put this big disclaimer out there, I am not an attorney at all. So, but what they were basically saying is, in the Castle Doctrine, you can protect your castle. I mean, it's the simplest terms that an attorney told me. You can protect your castle if you feel somebody's trying to come in. The prosecution did not want that in there. Well, there is a small, the devil's always in the details, Vlad. There is something in there called a mistake of fact that's part of this. It's the defense that's used. If you reasonably believe, and this is what this law says, if you reasonably believe you are in your castle, then you can defend it. That's all. Castle doctrines are not created equal. They're state by state. It's not a federal thing which goes across. So interesting to see. We don't know exactly how the jury interpreted that, or if they looked at it at all, or if the prosecution's case enough saying that she should have seen all the signs that it was not her place and didn't pay attention. We don't know what factored into their decision to go for the murder. One thing I can say, during closing arguments and during their arguments period, the prosecution was noting how Amber Guyger, who was carrying a first aid kit, who was trained in CPR, basically did a few moments of one-handed compressions of CPR and then left to go outside to find out what apartment she was at when she realized she was not in her apartment. They're saying she should have done more. She had combat gauze in her bag that was not opened at all. The prosecution held that up for the jury, saying, you're carrying this, you did nothing. And that was something that may have resonated with the jury. Of course, they're not talking. There's a gag order, and everybody, for the most part, has basically adhered to that gag order. So What shifted it for the jury? We're going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, it's interesting, Omar, too. You mentioned you're not a lawyer, neither am I, but one of the points that you made is for that Castle Doctrine to apply, you have to have a reasonable assumption that you are in your castle.
And that's the key word, reasonable. That was the key word, reasonable. The defense was saying it was reasonable, and they even brought up the lead investigator's information. They polled basically residents saying, have you ever walked into the wrong floor before? Have you ever walked into the wrong apartment? And some people said, absolutely, yeah, they did. Well, the prosecution basically countered it every time. One gentleman said, yeah, he walked in, saw a woman on a couch, realized it was not his place because he didn't recognize the woman or the couch. And the defense said, see, it happens. Well, the prosecution during cross-examination asked the gentleman, did you shoot that woman? No. Okay, I released the witness.
Right.
He was saying it happened, but her actions were different. And that was the big thing. Reasonable was the big term, and it seems at this point this jury sided with the prosecution.
Yeah, one of the prosecutors described Amber Guyger's testimony as garbage, saying, in fact, that it was absurd for a trained police officer, someone. It's one thing for you or I who may not be trained to observe our surroundings in great detail, the way a trained police officer, and she wasn't a rookie, was to be trained. So the prosecutor saying that she missed numerous signs that you just pointed out, Omar, in the complex. Number one being that she was on a floor higher than her own apartment. The other was that there was a welcome mat, the red welcome mat that you pointed to, that she did not have on her floor. And the other, which I thought was interesting, and I want to get your take on what you heard in the courtroom with regards to what ultimately the prosecution and the defense said about the fact that there was that ice cream and the cookies that were on the coffee table or that table in front of the television. Apparently, Botham Jean was perhaps watching television. Was it ever established that he actually stood up, or that, because she said she feared for her life? So I'm just trying to figure out how the prosecution established what he was doing in the moments leading up to his death.
Now, the defense basically reiterated it when Amber Guyger took the stand last Friday. She said that that he was moving forward towards her. Now, they brought in the medical examiner who looked at all the forensic evidence and talked about the path of the bullet. That's medical science. That's not really anything that is up for debate as far as which way the bullet went into Botham Jean's body. Apparently, it went in at an angle this way. And it hit the heart, it hit the lung, it hit the intestine twice, and came resting on the back. It did not go through his body. Now, she was not 9 feet tall and shooting down, so that led the medical examiner to believe that there was some sort of leaning. Either the defense said he was leaning forward, kind of insinuating that he was moving towards her. But the prosecution argued this could have been a man getting up off of his couch after somebody is coming to his apartment. Again, the jury seemed to believe the prosecutor on this side that he was getting up. You mentioned the bowl of ice cream. It was Thursday night. He had turned the lights off in his apartment. He had a bowl of ice cream. His TV was on. He was watching Thursday night football, like many Americans do. And this happened. She had just come off work, and she was coming to what she thought was her apartment, heard what was going on inside, and her training kicked in. This is something also the prosecution really went after. She used her training to carry her gear in her non-shooting hand, almost 30 pounds of gear, so she could keep her shooting hand accessible to her weapon. She followed that part when she was going in. Opened the door, even said, let me see your hands, let me see your hands. Also, another training by police. But prosecutors absolutely raked her over the coals, saying, how come you didn't follow your other training? You're trained to do CPR. Why didn't you do that? If you're in a situation where you are you're able to conceal and contain a suspect, you're walking distance from Dallas Police Headquarters. You had a radio on. You could have easily called in backup. And the quote that he used was, you could have had the cavalry there in 2 minutes in your own apartment. Why didn't you do that? You followed procedure here, but you didn't hear. What happened? Your mistake is what the prosecution was saying. Your mistake basically cost Botham Jean his life.
One last thing, Omar, before we bring on an attorney to talk to us about some of the legalities here. Amber Guyger was able to get into Botham Jean's apartment because his door was defective. Is that right?
Yes, and I'll go into it real quick. Apparently, the latching mechanism, the metal on the door, it wasn't latching, and it was bowed out, according to investigators, and it wouldn't fully close. And apparently this was not just a problem at his place. Apparently a lot of people who came up said, yeah, all the door latches are a little bit off. They don't kind of latch together. So for some places you had to pull it close, other places you had to pull it and then jiggle the handle to get it to slide in. And that is what the investigators are saying happened. She walked up to the apartment. It was slightly ajar. She pulled out her key. It's not a traditional key. It's not the metal key. It's a fob. So it's got electronics on it. So every key fits in, but not every key turns it. If it works, you will see a green light. You'll hear whirring, and you can turn the handle. If it doesn't work, you hear a red flashing light. Well, since it was cracked, apparently the defense says she pushed it in and saw that it was open, and that's when she said, uh-oh, somebody is inside what she thought was her apartment. So that was a big point of contention. There was no sign of forced entry into that apartment.
Really, really interesting. Omar, stand by. I want to bring into this discussion attorney Ken Belkin. He's joining me on the telephone. So, Ken, I don't know how long you've been tracking what Omar and I have been talking about with the news. If our audience is just joining us, that former Dallas police officer Amber Guyger, who was accused of shooting Botham Jean man in his own apartment when she mistakenly entered his apartment thinking it was her own. She's been found guilty by a jury of her peers of murder. But we were going back and forth, Omar and I, about this castle doctrine and how it could or could not apply in this particular case, being essentially a stand your ground doctrine in Texas that allows a homeowner to protect his or her home in the case of an attempt of an invasion. But the prosecution argued that this was not that. Can you explain for our audience?
There's a big gaping hole in this theory of defense that the castle doctrine applies. And put simply, she was not in her home. You know, typically the castle doctrine applies in Texas where you're in your own home, someone enters your home or your property, and you use lethal force to defend yourself. It is an affirmative defense that you can put forward. But she was not in her own home. Quite to the contrary, she was in the victim's home.
And so, Ken, the question then becomes, if she thought that she was in her apartment, and the question being the reasonable assumption that you are in your own home, could the jury have considered that?
I mean, the fact of the matter is, I can believe that I'm a 6'2" basketball player on the Knicks. It doesn't change the reality that I'm a 5'5" short, bald Jewish guy. Because she was mistaken, she is a police officer, she has training. It is incumbent on her to at least analyze the situation before deploying lethal force.
Okay, so now this, it's sort of interesting, too. One of the things that I what I thought was peculiar, but I guess it has to do with the state laws in Texas, was that originally Amber Guyger was not charged with some type of manslaughter. She was charged with murder, which, you know, carries a life sentence in Texas. Can you explain perhaps why in this particular instance the prosecution and the district attorney felt that they had no option but to charge her with murder?
Well, I can't question why the prosecutors did that. I think some of it might be politically motivated. You know, it's clear to me that this would have been more properly charged as a manslaughter, because I don't think she came into this situation with the intent to take this man's life. She thought she was in her own home, if you believe her version of events, and that she was acting in self-defense. But the reality is she was not.
Right. And so the other point that was made by the prosecution was that in the aftermath, after Botham Jean was shot, she, being a police officer with some type of training, did not really apply any kind of medical attention or procedures onto Botham Jean, and in fact stepped outside of the apartment. And they argue that that was another rationale for them saying that she clearly was not concerned with his well-being after the shooting had occurred.
Well, it's certainly an aggravating factor with respect to what charge she receives, what homicide-related charge she received. But the reality is, I don't think that the prosecution in this case, and the jury clearly disagreed, I don't think the prosecution in this case could prove that she intended to kill this man, which is an element of the murder charge that's necessary to be proven.
So now, if she, So to your point, which is I think is really interesting, is that if that is true, do you expect? And I know you can't speculate what a judge will ultimately decide, but I'm just given that the murder charge does carry a life sentence, how do you think the judge will sentence here?
I think he's going to take into account, the fact that she's a police officer, she served her community. Presumably, she has no prior contacts with the criminal justice system, or she wouldn't be qualified to be a police officer. And I think she's probably going to get, I think if the judge were being fair and not, consumed by all the coverage and the politics of it, I think the judge would be rightly served by giving as lenient a sentence as permitted under Texas state law.
Okay. Ken Belkin, thank you very, very much. We appreciate the analysis. Our Omar Villafranca is also on the ground there. There's a press conference that's happening very, very soon. So Omar had to run. He's going to be covering that. But we're going to obviously have a lot more news on this. Again, if you're just joining us here on CBS In There, you're looking at a live shot right now of that press conference that's going to happen in Dallas in just a short time. Obviously, when it does, we'll bring it to you. But if you're just joining us, a Texas jury has found that a former police officer, Amber Guyger, who shot her neighbor in his own apartment, has been found guilty of murder. She fatally shot Botham Jean in his apartment in Dallas on September 6th of last year. The 31-year-old claimed that she was on the wrong floor of the complex of her apartment building by mistake, and that she entered Botham Jean's apartment thinking it was her. She said she shot the 26-year-old because she thought he was an intruder and feared for her life. She was fired from the Dallas police officer. She was indicted on this murder charge. Well, now the jury, just moments ago, coming back with a verdict. That verdict, guilty of murder. We'll keep tracking the story.
National attention, even international attention, considering they're from St. Lucia. You got to be familiar with the family.
Yes.
How important was it for the community members to be surrounding this family?
So important. Every time that I see them, I hug them and I tell them I love you. And even when they leave, we will still be here and we'll still be doing the work. And I think that that gave them comfort.
Flo and Sheila, thank you guys so much. And Kara, what you heard from these ladies here, again, echoing sentiments that we've heard from community members across Dallas. It's different right now, a different feel around this courtroom. All week long, I've noticed that there was a certain sense of tension and just wondering what was going to happen today. Community members got the answer from the jury with that guilty verdict against Amber Guyger. Kara, we'll be talking to community members and giving you some glimpse of what's on their hearts and minds right now. Kara?